In their final hours, condemned prisoners get one last choice, their last meal. Some used it to show defiance. Others chose compassion. And a few left behind requests so shocking they still echo through history. These are the last meals that stunned America. Lawrence Brewer. Lawrence Russell Brewer's name is etched into American history not just for his crime, but for the ripple effect of his final hours. His last meal request was so outrageous, and his actions so defiant, that it ended a Texas tradition that had existed for decades. But before that moment, Brewer was already notorious for one of the most brutal hate crimes in modern U.S. history. Brewer was born in 1967 in Texas, and by most accounts, his childhood was marked by instability and prejudice. He gravitated early toward white supremacist groups, aligning himself with extremist ideologies that glorified racial hatred. By the late 1990s, Brewer had already been in and out of trouble, drifting through jobs and relationships, with prison time behind him. He carried himself as a hardened man, with hate-filled tattoos across his body that announced where his loyalties lay. On the night of June 7, 1998, Brewer, alongside two other white supremacists, John William King and Sean Berry, set out in Jasper, Texas. They encountered James Byrd Jr., a 49-year-old black man walking home after a family gathering. Byrd was offered a ride. What followed was a crime so shocking in its cruelty that it horrified the entire nation. The three men beat Byrd, then chained him by his ankles to the back of a pickup truck. They drove for miles down a rural road, dragging him until his body was torn apart. It was a killing steeped in racial hatred and carried out with calculated brutality. By the time it was over, Byrd's body had been dismembered, with pieces left scattered along the road. The crime scene was so horrific that even seasoned investigators were shaken. When news broke, the murder of James Byrd Jr. became a national symbol of racial violence in America. Protests erupted. Civil rights leaders, politicians, and ordinary citizens alike were appalled. President Bill Clinton spoke about it publicly. The crime spurred new hate crime legislation at both state and federal levels. The three perpetrators were quickly arrested and brought to trial. Evidence against Brewer was overwhelming. Witness testimony, forensic findings, and his own admission of involvement left little doubt. The jury found him guilty of capital murder. In 1999, Brewer was sentenced to death. His appeals lasted for more than a decade, but none succeeded. Brewer's lack of remorse only added to the outrage. In interviews, he bragged about the crime, showing no regret for what he had done. Even as execution day approached in 2011, Brewer insisted he would do it again, a declaration that left no room for sympathy. Then came the final detail, the one that would change Texas prison policy forever. As was tradition, Brewer was offered a chance to request a last meal of his choice. He asked for an enormous spread, 2 chicken fried steaks smothered in gravy, a triple bacon cheeseburger with fixings on the side, a large portion of fried okra, a barbecue plate with half a loaf of white bread, a full meat lover's pizza, 3 fajitas, a pint of ice cream, a slab of peanut butter fudge with crushed peanuts, and 3 root beers to wash it all down. The meal was prepared exactly as he ordered. When the tray arrived, it was overflowing with food, a feast fit for multiple people. But Brewer didn't eat a single bite. He pushed it aside and refused to touch any of it. Prison officials were stunned. To them, it was a mockery of a long-standing tradition. The point of the last meal was to allow a condemned person one final comfort, not to waste taxpayer resources on a spectacle. Word spread quickly, and when the public learned of Brewer's refusal to eat, outrage erupted. The loudest voice came from Texas State Senator John Whitmire, who called the act ridiculous and demanded the practice be stopped immediately. Within days, Texas prison officials announced a new policy. There would be no more special last meals for death row inmates. From that point forward, condemned prisoners would receive the same food served to every other inmate in the prison cafeteria. Brewer's defiance had ended a tradition that had stretched back generations. His crime had already placed him in history as one of America's most infamous killers. But his final act, ordering a lavish meal and refusing to eat it, made him the man who ended the last meal request in Texas forever. On September 21, 2011, Brewer was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. He was 44 years old. Witnesses reported that he showed little remorse, even in his final moments. Unlike other inmates who used their last words to apologize or reflect, Brewer offered none. His death closed a chapter in a case that had forever scarred the town of Jasper and the country as a whole. The family of James Byrd Jr. was there to see justice carried out. For them, Brewer's execution was not closure. No punishment could undo what had been done, but it was a final step in the long legal battle for accountability. Today, the legacy of Brewer's case lives on in two ways. First, in the tragic memory of James Byrd Jr., whose death helped drive forward hate crime legislation, including the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act signed into law in 2009. And second, in the way Brewer's last meal stunt permanently changed prison practice in Texas. When people talk about shocking last meals, Brewer's is always at the top of the list. Not because of what he ordered, but because of what he didn't do. He didn't eat it. That one act of defiance, combined with the monstrous nature of his crime, left a legacy of outrage that still resonates today. But while Brewer mocked the system with a feast he never touched, the next prisoner went the opposite way. Instead of extravagance, he made a request so simple and haunting that it has never been forgotten. Victor Feguer. Victor Harry Feguer was not a name anyone in Iowa had heard of before 1960. Born in Michigan in 1935, he grew up in the post-war years, drifting from place to place, never quite able to hold steady work or build stable relationships. By his mid-20s, he had no permanent ties, no close family nearby, no steady income, and a trail of petty trouble behind him. He was, in many ways, the kind of man who could walk into a town unnoticed and leave without anyone remembering his face. But in 1960, in the small city of Dubuque, Iowa, that would change. Victor Feguer arrived in town by bus. He rented a room in a boarding house and soon began to show the same restless pattern he always had, drinking, talking too much, and struggling to find a foothold. Then he made a decision that would end not only his own life, but also the life of an innocent man. On July 12, 1960, Feguer placed a phone call that would set everything in motion. He opened the Dubuque phone book, flipped through the pages, and found the listing for a local doctor. His name was Dr. Edward Bartles, a 34-year-old physician known in the community for being kind-hearted and willing to help anyone in need. Feguer phoned Dr. Bartles, pretending that a woman was sick and needed medical care. Trusting the voice on the other end, Bartles agreed to come. He drove out to the boarding house. It was the last time anyone saw him alive. Feguer kidnapped the doctor, forced him into his own car, and drove him across the Mississippi River into Illinois. At some point, he shot Dr. Bartles in the head with a small caliber pistol. His body was later discovered in a wooded area near Galena. The motive was never entirely clear. Some suggested Feguer wanted drugs, thinking a doctor might have access to narcotics. Others believed it was simply a senseless crime committed by a drifter seeking power and control. For the community, the shock was immense. Dr. Bartles was well-respected, young, and newly married. His murder seemed not only brutal, but meaningless. It didn't take long for law enforcement to catch up with Feguer. The FBI became involved because he had taken the victim across state lines, making it a federal kidnapping case. Feguer was arrested in Birmingham, Alabama, just days later, after trying to sell the doctor's car. He was quickly returned to Iowa to face trial. The trial itself was straightforward. The evidence against Feguer was strong. Witnesses had seen him with the doctor, he was in possession of the car, and eventually he admitted to luring Bartles under false pretenses. The defense tried to raise questions about his mental state, hinting at instability, but the jury was not swayed. In 1961, he was convicted of kidnapping, resulting in death, a federal capital offense. Sentencing came swiftly. The judge handed down the ultimate penalty, death. Because this was a federal case, the execution would not be carried out by the state of Iowa, but by the federal government. Feguer's appeals dragged on for 2 years. His lawyers pushed for clemency, arguing that he was mentally ill and that execution would serve no real purpose. At the time, the death penalty was already becoming more controversial in America. Executions were slowing, and public opinion was beginning to question whether they truly served justice. President John F. Kennedy personally reviewed the case when Figuere's request for clemency reached his desk. Kennedy was known to be cautious about capital punishment, often weighing clemency requests carefully, but in this case, he denied it. The brutality and senselessness of the crime left little room for mercy. That decision sealed Victor Figuere's fate. His execution was scheduled for March 15, 1963, at the federal penitentiary in Fort Madison, Iowa. It would be the last federal execution in the United States for nearly 4 decades. After Figuere's death, federal executions were halted, not to resume until 2001 with Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber. That historical fact makes Figuere's case stand out even more. As his final day approached, prison officials asked him what he wanted for his last meal. Some prisoners asked for fried chicken, steak, or extravagant spreads. But Figuere's request stunned them, a single olive with the pit still inside. When asked why, he explained that he hoped the pit would be buried with him and that a tree of peace might grow from his grave. It was a strange, haunting gesture, perhaps a final attempt at symbolism, perhaps an act of remorse, or perhaps simply another way to unsettle those who would remember him. On the morning of March 15, 1963, Figuere was led to the gallows inside the prison. At 28 years old, he was calm, quiet, and resigned. Witnesses reported that he showed little emotion, though the eerie request of the olive remained on everyone's mind. The olive pit was later found in his prison suit pocket after his body was taken down. Dr. Bartels' widow never remarried. His death left behind not just a grieving family, but a community that had lost a trusted physician. For them, Figuere's symbolic gesture meant nothing compared to the real life taken so brutally. History, however, remembers both sides: the young doctor whose life was stolen, and the drifter whose last request became one of the strangest footnotes in capital punishment. Victor Figuere was buried in Fort Madison. No tree grew from his grave. No symbol of peace sprouted from the soil. What remained was the story of a crime that never should have happened, and a last meal that still captures public imagination decades later. From a single olive to symbolize peace, we move to a man whose final hours were spent with something far more extravagant: steak, lobster, dessert, and even a movie marathon. Ronnie Lee Gardner. Ronnie Lee Gardner's name first entered Utah headlines in 1985, and it would remain there for decades as his case wound through one of the longest death penalty sagas in modern American history. Born in Salt Lake City in 1961, Gardner's early life was defined by instability. Accounts from those who knew him say he grew up in poverty, surrounded by abuse, neglect, and a constant presence of drugs and alcohol. By the time he was a teenager, Gardner was already deep into trouble, skipping school, using drugs, and committing burglaries. By his early 20s, Gardner had a record filled with violence. He was no stranger to the Utah criminal justice system, and by 1985, he was facing trial for yet another crime: the murder of Melvin Otterstrom, a bartender who was killed during a robbery in Salt Lake City. Gardner had walked into the Cheers Tavern with a gun, demanding money. In the chaos, he fatally shot Otterstrom and wounded another man. That crime alone would have likely put him behind bars for life. But what happened next sealed his fate forever. While being moved to court for a pretrial hearing in April 1985, Gardner managed to smuggle a gun into the courthouse. In a bold escape attempt, he pulled the weapon and opened fire inside the crowded building. A law student named Michael Burdell, who happened to be in the courtroom at the time, was shot and killed. A bailiff was also wounded. Chaos erupted in the courthouse as Gardner tried to flee. His plan failed, and he was quickly subdued and taken into custody. The murder of Michael Burdell shocked the community. Burdell was not Gardner's intended target, nor was he part of the trial. He was simply an innocent bystander, a 37-year-old law clerk pursuing a career in the legal system. Friends and family remembered him as gentle, intelligent, and idealistic. His senseless death made the crime even harder for the public to accept. Gardner was charged with capital murder, and prosecutors pursued the death penalty. His trial was highly publicized in Utah, with courtroom spectators hearing in detail how Gardner had plotted the escape and armed himself inside the courthouse. The jury convicted him of capital murder, and in 1985, he was sentenced to death. But the story did not end there. Gardner's legal journey would last 25 years. His case wound through appeals, motions, and stays of execution. His lawyers argued that he had grown up in horrific circumstances that shaped his violent path, that his childhood of abuse, neglect, and exposure to crime had damaged him beyond repair. They argued that executing him after decades on death row was cruel and unusual punishment. At various points, they raised questions of his competency and the fairness of his trial. Despite these efforts, appeal after appeal was denied. The courts repeatedly upheld his conviction and death sentence. By the late 2000s, Gardner's execution date had been set and postponed multiple times. The long delays frustrated both the victim's family and the public, who wondered how a case could drag on for a quarter of a century. In 2010, the final date was set. Utah would carry out its first execution by firing squad in over a decade. Gardner himself chose the method. At the time, Utah was one of the few states that still allowed it. An inmate sentenced before a certain date could opt for the firing squad instead of lethal injection. Gardner made that choice, saying it was more dignified. As the execution neared, attention turned to the question of his last meal. Some inmates chose simple, almost symbolic foods. Others requested massive amounts of comfort food. Gardner's request was memorable for its extravagance: a steak, a lobster tail, apple pie with vanilla ice cream, and to wash it all down, a 7-Up. But Gardner added something else. He asked if he could watch the entire Lord of the Rings film trilogy while eating. The prison agreed, and for his final hours, Gardner sat in his cell eating steak and lobster while immersing himself in the fantasy world of Tolkien's Middle-earth. It was perhaps one of the most unusual last meal requests ever granted in American history. The detail was striking. While awaiting execution, Gardner enjoyed an epic film trilogy about good versus evil, about struggle and redemption, while eating a meal that few inmates could ever dream of. To some, it seemed like indulgence. To others, it was an almost surreal humanization of a man who had spent 25 years on death row. On June 18, 2010, just after midnight, Gardner was led into the execution chamber at the Utah State Prison in Draper. He was strapped into a chair and given a target over his heart. Behind a curtain, 5 anonymous marksmen waited with rifles. Only 4 rifles were loaded with live rounds. One carried a blank, so no shooter would ever know if they had fired the fatal shot. When the warden gave the signal, the volley rang out. Gardner was pronounced dead at 12:20 a.m. He was 49 years old. The execution drew national and international attention. By 2010, firing squad executions had become almost unheard of in the United States. Many viewed it as barbaric, a relic of another era. But Gardner himself had insisted on it, saying he did not want lethal injection. His death reignited debates about the death penalty, the fairness of long appeals, and the methods used to carry out executions. For the family of Michael Burdell, the execution brought a complicated mix of emotions. Some of his relatives had opposed the death penalty from the beginning, noting that Burdell himself had been against capital punishment. Others believed justice had finally been served. In the end, what people remember most about Gardner's final hours is that unusual last meal: steak and lobster, apple pie with ice cream, and the sweeping tale of the Lord of the Rings. It remains one of the most extravagant and peculiar requests ever honored in U.S. death row history. To his advocates, Gardner's story was that of a damaged man who had lived a life of violence shaped by his upbringing. To his critics, it was proof of his brutality and lack of remorse. But regardless of perspective, his final meal stands as a haunting reminder of how even in their last hours, prisoners sometimes leave behind details that capture the public imagination long after their deaths. Ronnie Lee Gardner's execution marked not just the end of his life, but the end of an era in Utah's death penalty history. And while many may have forgotten the legal details of his decades of appeals, the image that lingers is unforgettable: a condemned man, savoring steak and lobster, watching a fantasy epic as the world counted down his final hours. Gardner indulged in fine dining and fantasy films, but the next prisoner stunned the world with how little he asked for. His choice was cold, minimal, and eerily fitting for who he was. Timothy McVeigh. On the morning of April 19, 1995, The heart of Oklahoma City was ripped apart by one of the deadliest acts of domestic terrorism in American history. A massive truck bomb, packed with nearly 5,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate fertilizer, fuel, and other explosives, detonated outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. The explosion was catastrophic. Entire floors of the 9-story structure collapsed in seconds. Glass shattered across downtown. The blast could be felt miles away. When the dust settled, the devastation was almost unimaginable. 168 people killed, including 19 children and hundreds more injured. The nation watched in horror as rescuers pulled victims from the rubble. It was, at the time, the single deadliest terrorist attack on U.S. soil. And at the center of it all was a man named Timothy James McVeigh. McVeigh was 27 years old at the time of the bombing. Born in 1968 in upstate New York, he grew up in a working-class family, described as quiet but intelligent. After high school, he joined the U.S. Army and served in the Persian Gulf War during Operation Desert Storm. Those who knew him during his military service recalled a disciplined, capable soldier, even decorated with a Bronze Star for his performance. But after leaving the Army, McVeigh's worldview hardened. He became increasingly obsessed with anti-government ideologies. He read extremist literature, followed conspiracy theories, and was particularly enraged by the events at Waco, Texas, in 1993, when a standoff between federal agents and the Branch Davidians ended in tragedy. To McVeigh, this was evidence of government tyranny. He resolved to strike back in the most dramatic way possible. Together with an accomplice, Terry Nichols, McVeigh plotted an attack on the Murrah Federal Building, which housed offices of the ATF, DEA, and Social Security Administration. On April 19, the second anniversary of the Waco siege, he carried out the plan. Nichols helped gather materials, but McVeigh was the one who drove the rented Ryder truck loaded with explosives and parked it outside the building. Minutes later, the bomb went off. The investigation that followed was swift. Within 90 minutes of the bombing, McVeigh was stopped by a state trooper for driving without a license plate and carrying a concealed weapon. By the time investigators linked the Ryder truck to him, he was already in custody. Evidence mounted quickly: receipts for explosive materials, testimony from Nichols, and eyewitness accounts. McVeigh's trial began in 1997. The prosecution laid out a detailed case: the planning, the motive, and the devastating results. Survivors and families of victims testified about the lives lost, the children who never came home from daycare, the families destroyed in an instant. The jury deliberated less than 2 days before finding McVeigh guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death. In prison, McVeigh was not a broken man. He was articulate, calm, and often unrepentant. He gave interviews where he justified his actions as retaliation against what he saw as an oppressive government. To many, his demeanor seemed chillingly detached. His appeals wound their way through the courts, but by the year 2001, every path had been exhausted. On June 11 of that year, Timothy McVeigh was scheduled to die by lethal injection at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. It was the first federal execution in the United States since Victor Feguer in 1963. For decades, no federal death sentences had been carried out, and McVeigh's execution marked the beginning of a new era. In the days before his death, the families of victims were given the option to watch via closed-circuit television. The federal government set up an unprecedented arrangement so more than 200 survivors and family members could witness the execution from Oklahoma City. For them, justice, long delayed, was finally at hand. And then came the question of his last meal. Many expected something elaborate, indulgent, or symbolic. After all, many condemned prisoners requested feasts of fried chicken, steak, or hamburgers. McVeigh's choice shocked people for its simplicity. He asked for just 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream, nothing else. The choice seemed cold, detached, and strangely fitting for a man who had caused so much devastation and shown so little remorse. Prison staff noted that he ate the ice cream calmly, with no outward signs of emotion, just as he had conducted himself throughout the trial and his years on death row. On the morning of June 11, 2001, McVeigh was led into the execution chamber. Witnesses described him as composed, even stoic. When asked for final words, he declined to make a spoken statement. Instead, He had chosen to leave behind a handwritten copy of a 19th century poem, Invictus by William Ernest Henley. The poem ends with the lines, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." At 7:14 a.m., Timothy McVeigh was pronounced dead. Outside the prison, crowds of protesters, victims' families, and reporters gathered. For some, it was closure. For others, it was only another painful reminder of what had been lost. The nation had executed its most notorious domestic terrorist, but the scars from Oklahoma City would never fully heal. McVeigh's last meal, those 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream, remains one of the most unsettling details of his final hours. Unlike other inmates who sought comfort, extravagance, or symbolism, McVeigh chose something stark and minimal. It reflected his personality in the eyes of many, cold, unemotional, and detached from the human cost of his crime. Even now, decades later, the image is haunting. One of America's most infamous criminals, calmly eating ice cream while the nation waited for his life to end. A man who killed 168 people, including innocent children, savoring something sweet in silence as his final act. McVeigh's mint ice cream was unsettling in its simplicity. But the next man shocked everyone by asking for a meal that wasn't even for himself. His request was an act of compassion that touched people far beyond prison walls. Philip Workman. Philip Ray Workman's life was a story of broken choices, spiraling addiction, and one violent act that would leave a police officer dead and a community mourning for decades. But unlike most death row inmates, it was his last request, not for himself, but for others, that made his name unforgettable. Workman was born in 1953 and grew up in Georgia. By many accounts, his childhood was troubled. As a young man, he turned to the Army, serving with the military police. But after leaving the service, his life unraveled. He struggled with drug addiction, particularly cocaine, and his behavior became more erratic. Jobs didn't last. Relationships broke apart. His dependence on drugs consumed him, and with it came a growing desperation to find money to feed the habit. On the night of August 5th, 1981, that desperation led to a deadly mistake. In Memphis, Tennessee, Workman entered a Wendy's fast food restaurant with a pistol, intending to rob the place. Employees complied with his demands, but one of them managed to trip a silent alarm. Within minutes, 3 police officers arrived on the scene: Lieutenant Ronald Oliver, Officer Aubrey Stoddard, and Officer Stephen Parker. What happened next was chaotic and remains debated to this day. A struggle broke out outside the restaurant. Witnesses recalled seeing Workman fire his gun. In the melee, Lieutenant Oliver was struck by a bullet and killed. The question that haunted Workman's case for decades was this: did Workman fire the fatal shot, or did another officer accidentally shoot Oliver during the confusion? Some ballistic evidence suggested the latter, but prosecutors argued that Workman had pulled the trigger that ended Oliver's life. Regardless, the outcome was the same. A respected police officer was dead, leaving behind a grieving family and colleagues. Workman was arrested within minutes of the shooting. At trial in 1982, the state painted him as a violent man who killed a police officer during a robbery. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. From that point forward, Workman's case became one of the longest and most controversial in Tennessee's modern history. His lawyers fought appeals for decades, raising serious questions about evidence, testimony, and whether he had actually fired the fatal shot. They pointed to issues with the state's forensic analysis and the credibility of certain witnesses. Some jurors later said they regretted their decision to convict. Even Lieutenant Oliver's daughter came forward years later to publicly state she did not believe Workman was guilty of killing her father. She argued that the real shooter may have been one of the other officers in the crossfire. Despite these doubts, courts consistently upheld the conviction. By the 2000s, Workman had become a well-known figure on Tennessee's death row. Advocacy groups rallied around his case, arguing it represented the flaws of the justice system. But in 2007, after more than 25 years of legal battles, the state scheduled his execution. As with every condemned inmate, Workman was asked what he wanted for his last meal. Prisoners often request lavish spreads of comfort food. But Workman did something unusual. He declined a meal for himself. Instead, he asked that a large vegetarian pizza be donated to a homeless person in Nashville. The prison denied the request. Officials stated that Tennessee did not allow special donations as part of final meal requests. But when word of his unusual choice spread, the public reacted in a way no one expected. Outside the prison and across Nashville, people were moved by the gesture. Homeless shelters began receiving dozens, then hundreds of pizzas delivered in Workman's name. Citizens paid out of their own pockets to honor the condemned man's request, turning his final wish into a reality, just not through official channels. On May 9, 2007, Philip Workman was executed by lethal injection at the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville. Witnesses reported that he offered a final statement before the chemicals flowed. He apologized to Oliver's family, insisting again that he had not fired the shot that killed the officer. He said, "I'm sorry for everything that happened. I truly am." The execution itself proceeded quietly. Workman showed no signs of fear or resistance as the drugs took hold. At 2:52 a.m., he was pronounced dead. He was 53 years old. The legacy of his case, however, lingered. Debate over whether he was truly guilty of firing the fatal shot has never been fully resolved. Some still argue the evidence against him was shaky at best. Others maintain that regardless of who fired the bullet, Workman created the situation that led to Letter Oliver's death, and for that, justice was served. But what most people remember about Philip Workman is not the crime or even the decades of appeals. It is the pizza. That one symbolic request transformed the way people saw him in his final hours. While many death row inmates used their last meals for indulgence, Workman chose compassion. He chose to think of those who had nothing, even as he faced death. It was an act that sparked headlines nationwide. Pizza for the homeless became the phrase associated with his name, turning a convicted man into an unlikely symbol of humanity at the very end of his life. To some, it was redemption. To others, it was hypocrisy. But no one could deny that the gesture touched lives far beyond the prison walls. Today, when people talk about shocking or unforgettable last meals, Philip Workman's request is always near the top of the list. Not because it was bizarre, but because it was selfless. In a system often remembered for cruelty and violence, his final act was one of unexpected generosity. Workman's unusual wish led to pizza being delivered to the homeless, but this next prisoner was not compassionate about his last meal. He was defiant. He made an outrageous order that changed Texas prison policy forever. John Wayne Gacy.
The clowning was relaxation for me. I enjoyed entertaining kids.
Few names in American true crime evoke as much horror as John Wayne Gacy. For years, he lived a double life. By day, a respected businessman and community volunteer, and by night, a sadistic predator who lured and murdered young men and boys. By the time his crimes were uncovered, the sheer scale of his killings left the nation stunned. His execution in 1994 closed one of the darkest chapters in U.S. criminal history. But even in his final moments, Gacy left behind an unsettling reminder of the ordinary and the grotesque, his last meal. Gacy was born in Chicago in 1942. His childhood was troubled. His father was an abusive alcoholic who often berated and beat him, while his mother was loving but unable to shield him from the violence. As a boy, Gacy suffered from health problems, including a congenital heart condition, which left him weak and excluded from sports. Those early years planted the seeds of insecurity that he would carry for the rest of his life. Despite his rocky start, Gacy tried to craft a life of stability. He married in the 1960s, moved to Iowa, and worked as a manager at several Kentucky Fried Chicken franchises owned by his father-in-law. By outward appearances, he was building the American dream: husband, father, and a promising career. But beneath the surface, darker tendencies were emerging. In 1968, Gacy was convicted of sexually assaulting a teenage boy in Iowa. He served time in prison, but after his release in 1970, he returned to Chicago determined to rebuild his image. He threw himself into local politics, community events, and business ventures. He became a contractor, started his own construction company, and even entertained children at parties and hospitals dressed as Pogo the Clown. The image of a smiling clown would later make his case infamous, turning him into the terrifying figure known as the Killer Clown. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy carried out a series of murders that shocked the nation. He lured young men and boys, often runaways, troubled teens, or employees from his construction business, back to his home. There, he would assault, torture, and strangle them. Most of the bodies were buried in the crawl space beneath his suburban Chicago house. Others were dumped in rivers nearby. By the time police uncovered the full extent of his crimes in December 1978, Gacy had murdered at least 33 victims. The discovery horrified even seasoned investigators. One by one, bodies were pulled from the crawl space, wrapped in plastic. The grim tally made Gacy one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. His trial in 1980 was one of the most widely covered of its time. Gacy's defense argued insanity, claiming he was not in control of his actions, but prosecutors countered with evidence of planning and deception, showing he was fully aware of what he was doing. The jury deliberated only hours before finding him guilty of 33 counts of murder. He was sentenced to death. For the next 14 years, Gacy remained on Illinois' death row. He became notorious for giving interviews where he denied responsibility or tried to shift blame, at times claiming he was framed or insisting he had been misunderstood. To the families of his victims, these statements were salt in the wound. They wanted accountability, and they wanted justice carried out. By 1994, after years of appeals, the state of Illinois set his execution date. On May 10th, Gacy's time finally came. When asked what he wanted for his last meal, he returned to the food of his past, perhaps a nod to his years managing KFC restaurants, or simply a reflection of his tastes. He requested a bucket of fried chicken, fried shrimp, French fries, fresh strawberries, and a Diet Coke. The choice was unsettling. Here was a man whose crimes had left families shattered, who had hidden bodies beneath his own home, sitting down to the comfort food of a fast food chain he once managed. It was ordinary, even banal, yet forever stained by the man who ordered it. On the night of May 9th, leading into the early hours of May 10th, Gacy ate his meal at Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill, Illinois. He showed little emotion. Witnesses described him as calm, even smug, as if still defiant to the very end. Shortly after midnight, he was led to the execution chamber. The method was lethal injection, which Illinois had adopted as its official practice. As the chemicals began to flow, Gacy looked toward the witnesses, among them family members of his victims. His final words were chilling in their arrogance. "Kiss my ass." At 12:58 a.m., John Wayne Gacy was pronounced dead. He was 52 years old. The execution brought a measure of closure to the families who had waited more than a decade for justice. But the pain of what he had done could never truly be erased. For many, the sight of him calmly enjoying fried chicken and strawberries on his last night was a bitter reminder of the humanity he denied his victims. Gacy's case continues to haunt the American imagination. The clown persona, the sheer number of murders, and the gruesome discovery beneath his home all contributed to his enduring infamy. His last meal, ordinary food tied to his own past, became another strange footnote in a story that already seemed too surreal to be real. What lingers most is the contrast. The innocence of children's parties with Pogo the Clown and the horror of 33 young lives stolen, the comfort of fried chicken and strawberries set against the cold cruelty of his murders, the defiance of his final words against the silence of the victims who never had a chance to speak again. Gacy's comfort food tied back to his past as a fast food manager, but the next inmate wanted no comfort food at all. Instead, he shocked officials with a request that was impossible to grant. Odell Barnes, Jr. On March 1, 2000, the state of Texas carried out the execution of Odell Barnes, Jr., a man whose final request would make him one of the most talked about death row inmates in history. Unlike others who asked for steak, fried chicken, or elaborate feasts, Barnes shocked prison officials by saying he didn't want food at all. His last request was for justice, equality, and world peace. It was a defiant statement, impossible to fulfill, that left a lasting mark on the long, controversial history of the death penalty. Barnes was born in 1968 in Texas. He grew up in a poor neighborhood, surrounded by crime, drugs, and limited opportunities. Friends and acquaintances described him as street smart and charming, but also prone to trouble. By his late teens, he was already running with the wrong crowd, drifting in and out of petty crime. Drugs and alcohol became part of his life, and with them came increasingly serious run-ins with the law. The crime that ultimately sent him to death row happened in 1989. On October 21st of that year, Barnes broke into the home of a woman named Helen Bass in Wichita Falls, Texas. Bass, a 44-year-old secretary at a local oil company, was brutally attacked. Prosecutors alleged that Barnes raped her, beat her, and stabbed her to death. The crime shocked the community for its violence. Evidence against Barnes included fingerprints found at the scene and testimony that linked him to the crime. In 1991, a jury convicted him of capital murder. He was sentenced to death, the harshest punishment Texas could impose. But as the years went on, Barnes' case drew growing controversy. Advocates and lawyers argued that the evidence against him was flawed, even pointing to possible misconduct. They claimed the fingerprints could have been left during a consensual encounter, that the forensic evidence was shaky, and that the state had ignored other possible suspects. Amnesty International and other human rights groups took up his cause, saying he may have been wrongly convicted. Barnes himself maintained his innocence throughout his years on death row. He gave interviews in which he described the system as corrupt and insisted he was not guilty of killing Bass. His case became a rallying point for critics of the death penalty, who argued that executing someone with so many unanswered questions highlighted the deep flaws of capital punishment. Despite the appeals and international attention, the courts rejected his legal challenges. By the end of the 1990s, after nearly a decade of legal battles, his execution date was set. Like every prisoner facing execution, Barnes was offered the chance to choose a last meal. But instead of requesting food, he gave an answer that stunned the prison staff: justice, equality, and world peace. It was a statement rather than a request, one that highlighted his defiance and his belief that the real injustice was what was about to happen in the death chamber. On the night of March 1st, 2000, Barnes was escorted to the death chamber at the Huntsville unit. Witnesses, including family members of the victim, gathered to watch as the state prepared to administer the lethal injection. Barnes used his final words not to apologize, but to again declare his innocence and criticize the justice system. He told the victim's family that he regretted their pain, but insisted he was not responsible for the crime. Then he addressed the world, saying he hoped his death would bring attention to the flaws of the system and to the cause of human rights. At 6:21 p.m., the lethal drugs began to flow. Moments later, Barnes was pronounced dead. He was 31 years old. His execution left behind more questions than answers. For the Bass family, there was relief that justice had finally been carried out after a decade of legal delays. But for activists and opponents of the death penalty, Barnes became a symbol of what they saw as a system stacked against the poor, the marginalized, and the potentially innocent. The image that remains most vivid, though, is that last request. In a state where last meals often made headlines for being extravagant or peculiar, Barnes's answer stood apart. He didn't want food. He wanted things no prison, no government, no executioner could possibly give him: justice, equality, and world peace. Some saw it as sarcasm, others as defiance, and others still as a genuine plea for a better world, even as his own life came to an end. Whatever the intent, the statement ensured that his final act would be remembered. Decades later, his name is still invoked whenever the topic of unusual or symbolic last meals comes up. Barnes asked for justice instead of food, a demand that could never be met. But then came a man whose final meal revealed something far more unsettling. He saved part of it for later. What did he have in mind? Ricky Ray Rector. Ricky Ray Rector's story is remembered for the violence that put him on Arkansas's death row and for the haunting way he faced his final moments. His last meal included steak, fried chicken, cherry Kool-Aid, and pecan pie. But what unsettled everyone was not what he ate, it was what he didn't. Rector pushed the pie aside and said he was saving it for later. Those simple words revealed something about his state of mind that made his execution one of the most controversial in modern history. Rector was born in Arkansas in 1950. As a young man, he was known in his community as friendly and easygoing. He didn't have a history of serious crime and was not thought of as a violent person. But on March 22, 1981, everything changed. That evening, Rector went to a nightclub in Conway, Arkansas. An argument broke out, and in the heat of the moment, he pulled out a gun. He opened fire, killing a man named Arthur Criswell and wounding two others. The sudden violence shocked those who knew him. Rector fled the scene, and police began looking for him. 2 days later, on March 24th, Officer Robert Martin, a respected veteran of the Conway Police Department, went to Rector's mother's home. Officer Martin was well known in the community, and he knew Rector's family personally. He hoped to defuse the situation and bring Rector in peacefully. At first, it appeared Rector would surrender, but as Officer Martin turned, Rector drew a weapon and fatally shot him. The murder of Officer Martin devastated Conway. He was known as a dedicated officer, a family man, and a friend to many. His death left the town grieving and demanding justice. After the shooting, Rector attempted to take his own life. He survived, but the injury caused significant damage to his brain. Surgeons saved his life, though the procedure left him with lasting cognitive impairments. Those who examined him later said he was left functioning at a much lower capacity, unable to fully understand or process consequences. When Rector went to trial, his defense team argued that he was no longer competent to face capital charges. Prosecutors countered that regardless of his impairments, he was responsible for killing Officer Martin. The jury agreed with the state. In 1982, Rector was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. For the next 10 years, appeals and legal challenges focused on his mental state. His attorneys argued that executing a man who lacked full awareness of what was happening would be unconstitutional. They cited his confused behavior in prison, his childlike mannerisms, and his inability to grasp the seriousness of his situation. Journalists who met him on death row reported similar impressions, that Rector did not appear to fully understand the reality of his execution. But the courts were unmoved. After a decade of hearings and appeals, his sentence was upheld. By early 1992, Arkansas set the date for his execution. On January 24, 1992, Ricky Ray Rector was served his final meal. He ate most of it, the steak, the fried chicken, the cherry Kool-Aid. But when it came to dessert, the pecan pie, he placed it carefully to the side. "I'll save it for later," he reportedly said. Those who witnessed it were struck by the comment. It seemed to confirm what many had long argued, that Rector did not fully comprehend that there would be no later. That evening, Rector was escorted into the death chamber at the Cummins unit. The procedure itself was unusually difficult. Because of his earlier head injury and past surgeries, staff struggled to locate a usable vein for the lethal injection. Witnesses said the preparation took nearly an hour, with multiple attempts before the IV line was finally placed. The delay added to the already heavy atmosphere, underscoring the unease many felt about the case. At 9:15 p.m., the lethal chemicals began to flow. Minutes later, Rector was pronounced dead. He was 41 years old. The execution became one of the most talked about in U.S. history. Supporters of the sentence said Rector had killed a police officer in cold blood and that the punishment was appropriate. Opponents argued that executing someone so impaired was not justice, but cruelty, that Rector was no longer the same man who had committed the crime and could not truly grasp his fate. The case also became a national political moment. Then Governor Bill Clinton, who was running for president in 1992, left the campaign trail briefly to return to Arkansas and personally oversee that the execution proceeded as scheduled. Critics later argued that the move was political theater, meant to show toughness on crime. For many who remember Ricky Ray Rector's story, though, it is not the legal debates or the politics that stand out. It is the image of that untouched slice of pecan pie. To some, it symbolized his confusion, his inability to understand that he would never return to finish it. To others, it was a heartbreaking gesture that revealed the deeper tragedy of putting a man with severe impairments to death. Rector's untouched pecan pie raised chilling questions about his state of mind. The next death row inmate made one of the strangest requests ever made. Something so bizarre, prison officials refused it outright. James Edward Smith. James Edward Smith's case is one of those chilling reminders that not every death row prisoner fits the familiar mold of a cold-blooded killer. His crime was brutal, his life shaped by violence and instability, But what set him apart forever in the history of executions was what he asked for at the very end. Unlike steak, burgers, or fried chicken, his last meal request was a lump of dirt, a bizarre choice that revealed the depths of his unusual beliefs and left prison officials stunned. Smith was born in 1952 in Jefferson County, Texas. His upbringing was rough, marked by instability and fractured family life. As a young man, he joined the military, serving briefly in the Army, where he earned an honorable discharge. But life after service didn't offer much structure. He drifted, bouncing between jobs, and his path soon took him into darker territory. By the early 1980s, Smith had developed a fascination with the occult. Friends and acquaintances described him as obsessed with rituals, mysticism, and unusual practices. That interest in ritual would later play a haunting role in his final days. His crime occurred in March 1983 in Houston, Texas. Smith entered an office building intending to commit a robbery. Inside, he encountered a 47-year-old woman named Larry Rosenbaum, a clerk working in the building. Armed with a gun, Smith demanded money. But during the encounter, something went terribly wrong. When Rosenbaum hesitated and attempted to flee, Smith shot her. She died of her injuries. Police tracked Smith down shortly after. He confessed to the robbery and the shooting, but what truly unsettled investigators was the reasoning he later gave. Smith claimed he needed money for rituals and practices tied to his belief in voodoo. He spoke openly about spiritual forces, magical thinking, and the idea that his life was governed by powers beyond his control. At trial, the prosecution presented the crime in straightforward terms. Smith had robbed and killed an innocent woman. The defense, however, tried to build a case around his mental state, suggesting that his obsession with ritual and mysticism pointed to severe psychological problems. They argued that he was not fully rational, that his belief in the supernatural colored everything he did. The jury was not persuaded. The crime was brutal and unnecessary, and Smith's talk of rituals only made him seem more dangerous. In 1983, he was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. From there, Smith began the long road of appeals. For years, his lawyers argued that he was mentally unfit for execution, pointing to his erratic behavior and strange obsessions. Psychiatrists examined him, noting his fixation on rituals and his inability to separate fantasy from reality. But in the end, the courts rejected these claims. His conviction and death sentence stood. By 1990, his execution date was set. The state of Texas prepared to carry out the sentence. And then came the moment that ensured James Edward Smith would be remembered, his last meal request. When asked what he wanted, Smith didn't ask for fried chicken, burgers, or sweets. He asked for a lump of dirt. Specifically, he requested Rayakunda dirt, a kind of soil used in voodoo rituals. He explained that he intended to use the dirt for a ritual connected to his beliefs, something that he thought would protect him in the afterlife. Prison officials were stunned. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice had dealt with plenty of odd requests before, but never something like this. After reviewing the request, they denied it. Officials said they could not provide dirt for health and security reasons. It was simply not allowed. Instead, they gave him a cup of plain yogurt. Smith reportedly accepted it quietly, but the symbolism was lost. What he had wanted was not food, but a tool for a ritual. Denied that, he faced the end without the comfort of the belief system he had clung to for so long. On June 26, 1990, James Edward Smith was led to the execution chamber in Huntsville, Texas. Witnesses described him as calm but still speaking in strange, ritualistic terms. When asked if he had any final words, he said something cryptic. "Okay, I have no final statement, but the earth will remember me." Moments later, the lethal injection began. At 6:08 p.m., he was pronounced dead. He was 37 years old. For the family of Larry Rosenbaum, the execution brought an end to years of waiting. The pain of losing her in such a senseless act could never be erased, but justice had finally been served. For the public, however, Smith's case was remembered less for the details of his crime and more for that strange last meal request. A lump of dirt, something no prison could ever provide, remains one of the most bizarre and unsettling requests in the history of American executions. In the years since, his story has often been cited in lists of shocking last meals. standing alongside inmates who asked for extravagant feasts or who mocked the system with their choices. But Smith's wreck wasn't about indulgence or mockery. It was about belief. Right up until the end, he clung to the idea that ritual and soil could guide him into the next world. It's a reminder that the death penalty often intersects not only with crime and punishment, but with the complex, sometimes irrational inner worlds of the condemned. For James Edward Smith, his final request was not about comfort for the body, but about protection for the soul. Smith's request for something no one could serve made headlines for its sheer oddity. But the next man went in the opposite direction. His last meal wasn't symbolic or spiritual. It was pure excess, a breakfast so massive it left the kitchen staff stunned. Allen Lee Davis, Allen Lee, also known as Big Al Davis, was a man whose crimes were so brutal that they still haunt Florida's history. His execution in 1999 marked not only the end of his life, but also the near end of an era, the era of Florida's use of the electric chair. Yet beyond the crime and the controversy over how he died, what captured people's attention was his shocking last meal. Unlike prisoners who requested something symbolic or even refused food altogether, Davis asked for an enormous breakfast, a feast so large it stunned the prison staff. And he ate every bite. Born in 1944, Davis grew up in Florida. He was described as a troubled man long before his most infamous crime. His early years were filled with instability, brushes with the law, and a reputation for being aggressive. By the 1980s, Davis was a large, imposing figure. He weighed over 340 pounds and had a record of violent tendencies. But no one could have predicted the level of savagery that would follow on one summer day in 1982. On May 11, 1982, Davis broke into the Jacksonville home of 37-year-old Nancy Weiler. Nancy was pregnant at the time and lived there with her husband and two daughters, Christina, 11, and Catherine, 5. What happened inside the home was so horrific that even seasoned investigators struggled to put it into words. Davis attacked Nancy, beating and killing her in a way that revealed both cruelty and rage. He then turned on the two children, murdering them as well. The crime scene was described as one of the worst in Florida's modern history. The murders shocked Jacksonville. Nancy had been well-liked in her community, a wife and mother who was preparing to welcome another child. Her daughters were young, innocent, with their whole lives ahead of them. The brutality of the attack and the senselessness of the killings left the city reeling. Within days, Davis was arrested. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and prosecutors quickly charged him with 3 counts of first-degree murder. His trial in 1983 was emotional and contentious. The state presented the gruesome details of the murders, painting Davis as a remorseless killer who deserved the harshest punishment available. The jury agreed. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to death. From that moment forward, Davis began the long journey of appeals common to capital cases. For over 15 years, his lawyers tried to overturn the conviction or reduce the sentence. They raised questions about the trial, the jury, and the method of execution itself. But time and again, the courts upheld the death penalty. The brutality of the crime left little doubt in the minds of judges and the public alike that Davis would ultimately face execution. By the late 1990s, Florida was already facing mounting criticism over its use of the electric chair. Nicknamed Old Sparky, the chair had been used for decades, but in several recent executions, there had been troubling reports: smoke, sparks, and even flames during electrocutions. Human rights groups argued that the method was cruel and outdated. Against this backdrop, Allen Lee Davis's execution became a flashpoint in the national debate. As his execution date approached, Davis was asked the same question every condemned inmate hears: what would you like for your last meal? Many prisoners request comfort food from their childhoods: fried chicken, hamburgers, ice cream. Some make symbolic or defiant requests. A few refuse food altogether. Davis, however, went a different direction. He asked for a meal so large that it raised eyebrows. His last meal request was staggering: 2 fried eggs, cooked over easy, a large portion of fried potatoes, half a loaf of bread, buttered, a full pound of fried bacon, and to wash it down, a full quart of milk. It was a breakfast meant for several people, not one man. Yet it seemed to fit the man they called Big Al, whose size alone made him stand out among Florida inmates. When the meal was delivered, Davis ate it calmly and completely. Unlike Lawrence Brewer, who ordered an enormous feast only to refuse it, Davis wiped the plates clean. There was no symbolism, no statement, just indulgence. On July 8, 1999, Davis was led to Florida's execution chamber at Stark Prison. Strapped into Old Sparky, he faced his final moments. Witnesses described a disturbing scene. As the electric current surged through his body, blood appeared on his face, soaking into the chest strap of the chair. The gruesome sight drew immediate outrage and renewed calls to end electrocution as a method of execution. Florida officials insisted the execution was carried out correctly and that Davis had died quickly. But the images circulated widely, sparking national and international criticism. For the Weiler family, who had waited nearly 2 decades for justice, the controversy over the execution method was less important than the fact that Davis was finally gone. Nancy's husband, who had lost his wife, daughters, and unborn child in one day, expressed relief that the case had reached its end. In the years since, Allen Lee Davis's name has been tied to 2 legacies. First, his crime, the brutal murders of a pregnant woman and her 2 daughters, remains one of the darkest chapters in Jacksonville's history. Second, his execution played a role in shifting Florida away from the electric chair and toward lethal injection, as the state could no longer ignore the backlash after the spectacle of his death. But among the details that people continue to recall, his last meal stands out. While some condemned inmates used their final request to make symbolic statements, Davis chose excess, a breakfast heavy with bacon, eggs, potatoes, bread, and milk consumed without hesitation just hours before his death. To many, it felt grotesque, a man who had taken so much from others, treating himself to a feast in his final moments. To others, it was simply a reminder that executions often reveal the stark contrast between ordinary human acts like eating breakfast and the horrific crimes that led to that moment. In the long history of shocking last meals, Allen Lee Davis's request remains one of the most memorable. It wasn't eerie like Victor Fager's Lone Olive. It wasn't compassionate like Philip Workman's Pizza for the Homeless. It wasn't mocking like Lawrence Brewer's Untouched Feast. It was indulgent. A man who had shown no mercy to his victims, sitting down to a meal so large it became part of his legacy. If you found this video chilling, don't forget to subscribe for more true crime stories. Like this video if you think last meals reveal more than words ever could, and let us know in the comments which request shocked you the most.